Good evening and welcome to Tracking the Tropics, your weekly in-depth look at the hurricane season. I'm CBS 17 Chief Meteorologist Wes Hohenstein in Raleigh, North Carolina, and we're now in week 7 of the Atlantic hurricane season and in the middle of our second month of the 2020 Atlantic hurricane season. So here's what we have coming up tonight on episode 7 of Tracking the Tropics.
Hi, I'm meteorologist Spencer Atkins, and I'm in Charleston, West Virginia. But tonight, we're going to focus on trying to put back what nature takes away in a hurricane. Of course, you hear about beach erosion from the big wind and the waves. Well, Hurricane Florence did some major damage to the beaches in North Carolina. I'll take you there, and we're going to find out what they're doing to restore the beaches across the Crystal Coast.
I'm CBS 17 Storm Team Meteorologist Brian Hutton Jr. in Raleigh, North Carolina. Coastal evacuations in the face of an incoming hurricane are nothing new. But what will storm shelters look like this year in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic? Coming up, I talk with the head of the North Carolina Emergency Management Agency and others about their plans and should shelters need to be activated. You may also want to make alternate plans to shelter now, and we'll explain why the government doesn't want you to rely on them for your first option of safety.
Okay, Brian and Spencer, we'll get you guys in just a second. Let's talk about first what is going on in the tropics. Can you believe we are about halfway through July, 14 days into July, but we are also 18 weeks into our new world with the pandemic. And I say that because usually in the middle of July, everyone's on vacation somewhere, either on a beach or maybe in the Caribbean. And I'm sorry to say, this would be an excellent time to be somewhere on a tropical island in the Caribbean or in the Bahamas, because there is absolutely nothing going on in the upper levels of the atmosphere. I mean, we're barely seeing any afternoon thunderstorms develop in and around the Bahamas, on the Caribbean islands. So not a whole lot going on. And this is usually the place where we see stuff form this time of year, the Gulf of Mexico, in the Caribbean, around the Bahamas. But as you can see with me, there's just nothing going on. However, down in the water, wow, we have some amazingly hot water temperatures. So if anything does eventually bubble up in the coming weeks, I have no doubt that it'll have no trouble intensifying very quickly. So they got the temperature gradient across the top, but what I want you to know is where you see these kind of deep reds, purples, maroons, I mean, that's where we're talking temperatures approaching 90 degrees. Everything else is pretty much in the 80s. Of course, we need 80-degree water temperature. That's one of the main ingredients to get tropical activity to form. But when you get close to 90, that's when something will develop, and then it hits that 90-degree water, and it can just explode in intensity, almost like the humidity and the steam, all that moisture in a small bathroom after you take a really hot shower. That's kind of what's happening down in parts of the Caribbean and the Bahamas. Other than that, back into the upper levels of the atmosphere, not only are things calm out in the Gulf of Mexico and in the Caribbean, but we look into the open waters of the Atlantic and there's just not a whole lot going on. Typically this time of year, things slowly start to ramp up. It's not really until August and September that we see a lot of activity along the intertropical convergence zone. But also this time of year, sometimes we see some waves starting to come off the coast of Africa. And look, you can see one has tried to come off, but it kind of just fizzles out. So nothing really going on. And part of the reason goes back to something that we talked a lot about a few weeks ago, the Saharan dust. This is something that made it all the way over to the United States, gave us some haze in the United States, gave us some great sunsets and sunrises. Well, it's still out there like it's out there every year. It's just kind of relaxed a little and no longer is making it all the way to the continental United States, but it's still out there. And I want to show you the forecast and show you why I would not be surprised if something does start to bubble up as we head into next week. So we'll pick up the forecast with our current time, and it's showing us that, yes, there is a little Saharan dust in the upper atmosphere over the Caribbean, which would make sense because that was our first map. We showed you not a whole lot was going on. So we'll put the maps into motion. We'll watch what's happening over there, far right part of your screen, as we go through the end of this week and this weekend. See what happens. There's a lot less color out there. There's a lot less forecast dust to be in the upper atmosphere. So by the time we get to next Tuesday, not as much going on in the dust department over the Caribbean. So that could possibly mean maybe that's when we'll start to see some activity in that part of the world. Usually this time of year, in the month of July, the places we look are similar to the places we look to in June. And it's got a great map here from the tropical meteorologist at Colorado State University. And this gives us every tropical system that's formed in July, all the way back to 1851. And then here's your key: tropical storm, category 1 or 2 hurricane, or category 3, 4, 5 hurricane, green, blue, or red dots. We don't really care what forms, we care where it forms. And this time of year, you can see a few clusters. You can see the clustering of storms forming in the Gulf of Mexico. You can see it clustering off the coast of the southeast United States. And what's different than the June map is not as much forming in the Caribbean, but more activity forming in the open waters of the Atlantic. So these are your typical July storm formation points. So when we check in on the tropics, one of the first places I always check is, well, what's going on close to home? Because as you can see, this is where most of the activity forms. And that's important because if it's forming right in your own backyard, you usually don't have a lot of time before it's impacting someone. So as we kind of take a step back and look at the season in a whole, it started on the first day of June. Of course, we had activity in May. It goes all the way to the end of November. This graph shows us, as we go from left to right, goes from May to December, tropical activity. And obviously there's a peak that really starts to ramp up and peaks the second week of September. But if you think about it, here's where we are on that graph. We're still in a place on the graph where there's hardly anything going on. So the fact that there isn't anything going on isn't really a surprise. That's typical for a regular tropical season. Things don't really get going until we get to about the first day of August. A lot of people call that the real start of the hurricane season because that's when activity, August and September, really starts to ramp up. But the activity we're typically seeing now is very similar to the activity we see, if I go to the other side of the graph, sometime in the first or second week of November. And you think of November, there's usually not a lot going on in the tropics. Well, that's kind of the way it is in July as well. But so far this year, we have made it through 6 named storms, all the way through Faye. If you think about it, it was a week ago that we were watching an area of low pressure in Georgia that eventually developed into Tropical Storm Faye. We've had 3 tropical storms, Bertha, Cristobal, and Faye, hit the United States. That's this year. But I want to tell you about 1886. In 1886, that hurricane season had 3 hurricanes already hit the United States by the middle of July. So 1886, you think to yourself, well, how do we know what was going on? Back in 2004, several meteorologists did a huge study on past tropical activity. They went all the way back to the 1800s. They used a lot of different data. It was a huge research project, so they were able to gather a lot of information about storms that hit the United States. And here are the 3 hurricanes that hit the United States by this time in July back in 1886. There was one that hit the Texas-Louisiana border, and there were 2 just in the first month and a half of the season that hit the Florida Panhandle. And actually, they didn't intersect, but at different times they came across the same point in southern Georgia. So back in 1886, our friends in southern Georgia had a rough time of it. Again, a lot of research went into this. There's not obviously as much information for today's storms as what they had with meteorologists back then, but they have an idea of what that season looked like. And here's just a snapshot of the storms that impacted the United States. And we've had all these tropical storms so far. Look at what they had. They had a hurricane. They had a lot of intense activity, including a possible 150-mile-per-hour hurricane. And this was all back in 1886. So I know we've had a busy season in 2020, but I think I'm thankful that it is not what was going on back in 1886. All right, so let's move on to our first guest. You know, it's the middle of the hurricane season, which also means it's the middle of vacation season at the beach. And the battle of keeping the beaches full of sand despite year after year of tropical systems is a tough one. So tonight we're going to go inside that fight and talk beach renourishment. And for that, WOWK Chief Meteorologist Spencer Adkins in Charleston, West Virginia, has basically been researching this topic for years thanks to many beach vacations in North Carolina, and he's with us live tonight on Tracking the Tropics. Spencer, you're just back from the North Carolina coast, and I'm not going to ask you to share your family vacation pictures from that trip. You did learn a lot about what it takes to keep the sand under our toes on the beach when we go on vacation. Tell us about it.
Absolutely. And hi, Wes, from the banks of the Kanawha River in Charleston, West Virginia, where that's our coast. And we actually have a town that is spelled hurricane 20 minutes from here, but it's pronounced hurricane in West Virginia. We don't have any record of any hurricanes, though, in Hurricane, West Virginia. What we do, of course, have records of our modern day satellite radar and, of course, firsthand knowledge and video of watching what happened to Florence back in 2018. This is Carteret County, and this is this little sandbar here. It's a little bit bigger than little. It's a 20-mile sandbar plus, and that's known as the Bogue Banks. And that really got hit hard by Florence with the wind and the erosion. And then to go there again and see it firsthand the next season, of course, was pretty remarkable. But also remarkable were the efforts to put the sand back on the beach for the environment and the economy. Let me take you there to see what they're doing. The power of wind and waves and water was never more evident than right here along the North Carolina seacoast on these beaches during Hurricane Florence in 2018. Millions of cubic yards of sand just eroded, washed right back out to the ocean, which damaged, of course, not only the environment, but also the economy, which is why there is such a big effort to replenish, restore, and renourish these beaches.
So, you know, Florence was our storm of record, and if you look at just about any metrics possible.
Greg Rudy Rudolph's job with the Carteret County Shore Protection Office is to help rebuild the beaches and the dunes.
It was easily the most volume of sand that's been removed from the island. We lost about 3 million cubic yards of sand across maybe 20 miles of the island.
To put that in perspective, that's 250,000 dump trucks of sand that hold 12 cubic yards. Hauling sand in? Not an option. So the county hired a crew that specializes in beach renourishment, using some of the sand that was lost and some from an underwater stockpile the county uses. That gets taken out from dredging the harbor in nearby Morehead City. The sand is pumped from barges onto the beach through a series of pipes, and then they contour it with bulldozers. It's quite a scene, and it's been done during the cold season when tourists are not around.
For the beaches, it pretty much wiped out the dunes that you could kind of see up behind me here. So our job was to pump up the volume of sand that we lost during Florence, and in that process kind of reconfigure brand new dune. To fortify the dune, we like to plant it.
They plant the dune mainly with sea oats, millions of them.
And then you'll see a brand new shoot pop out in the middle in a day or two. And then about a year and a half, they'll actually shoot up the actual sea oat that, you know, people I'm associated with.
1 year later, this is what those plantings will look like. These were obviously planted 1 year ago, and you can see it's already starting to collect sand and prevent erosion. This is the natural dune line right here. They'd like to see all 20 miles come back to this kind of a look and protection.
Look, I mean, that root was way down here. I mean, that was a plant that kept on growing up, and up. So that's exactly what we're doing here. You know, the sand's obviously moving up and down the profile every year, and it doesn't move a lot, if you will, unless we get a Florence. So, you know, we can monitor that and kind of set up our targets of how much volume in the system is good, you know, versus bad.
So the moving of the sand and the planting, that's reaching conclusion. Now it's a matter of time and nature cooperating to keep building back what nature also took away.
Fascinating stuff, Spencer. I got a lot I want to talk to you about. That's a lot of engineering involved, but it's not like when we built a sandcastle when we were kids. It's a lot more complicated than that. And I want to talk about how that science works, and then how on earth do you stockpile sand underwater? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, exactly. Well, again, let's get oriented. So here you are in Raleigh, and we'll go down to Carteret County, and let's remember, this is just one county, okay? North Carolina has an expansive seacoast, but they have a shore protection office, and Greg tells me, you know, they really got into this about 20 years ago, and they kind of looked at some things that the Dutch are doing everywhere along the beach line here. And what they're really kind of preoccupied with here and focused on would be the Bogue Banks, because again, when you get to Cape Lookout and looking out to the north and to the east, it's a little more wild. So this is where you have the houses and the condos, things like that. They really want to stabilize that, it is a fairly stable beach to begin with. But they have measuring points all along, and they know exactly the volume of sand that's out there. They lost 3 million cubic yards. They have a stockpile over here out of Morehead City, about 3 miles offshore, where they have been digging and keeping Morehead City Harbor open and to about 45 feet depth. They take that sand, it literally has to be inspected. They take it out and they put it out underwater, and even though there's a current, it stays there. It's like a big sandbar. They're stockpiling 20 million cubic yards, so they haven't even used a full fourth of what they have piled up out there, and it has taken now 2 phases. Phase 3 will come back this next winter, and they're actually going to end up with a total of 5 million cubic yards of fresh sand that they put back out there. They're going to stabilize it and make sure that it's all good by planting those sea oats, and then nature takes care of that. And I thought it was kind of interesting too, Wes, that they said that you can actually have a year, if you don't have any storms and you have some nice onshore flow of the wind, just the natural transport of sand could put as much as 400,000 cubic yards of sand back on the beach just without even their help. But you can also have just a normal year where you lose that much too, which would end up being 33,333 dump trucks. And if you think how long that would take, it takes quite some time. So they're really, really impressive with their barges and their pipelines and the slurry that they pump up on the beach. They contour it and then they plant it with the sea oats. It's an amazing feat of engineering that they're getting done in rapid fashion, just in one county alone, to the tune of about $87 million between federal, state, and county funds.
Wow, that's an amazing science I don't think I've ever dived into. Tell us about North Carolina. How does North Carolina's coast, that little small section, compare to other states? And I'm also curious about the underwater marine life. How do they take care of the animals under the water?
Yeah, and that's all a big concern because, again, you're dealing with federal regulation. So let's look at that again. You're looking at something like a 21 mile stretch of beach. So if you compare that shoreline, straight line from end to end, it would be about 25 miles of the actual area that they take care of. Let's go up to New Hampshire. Now, I know it's not a sandy beach. They have 13 miles of coastline that they take care of. Let's see, other states, Delaware, 28 miles, and Maryland, 31 miles. So you can see just one county alone really has a lot to deal with, and they're so far ahead of the curve, basically engineering-wise, and seeing that vision, and they really try to protect that resource. And then as far as looking at nature, like you talked about, there's a lot of those, say, loggerhead turtles, like this one right here, and what they do is they take what they call a trawl, and they go out ahead of the barges and out ahead of the pipes so that they're not accidentally sucking up these beautiful creatures. And let's see, if I remember right, they had something like 6 loggerheads that they were able to relocate. And again, they're trying to avoid anything in terms of further endangering the species, because that actually also is a nice habitat. And if you've ever vacationed there or seen the stories or been there, as soon as there are eggs, there's a whole squad of volunteers. They know exactly what they're doing. They'll come out and take care of that and see that once they hatch, that those turtles make it back safely into the ocean. So it's quite a balance between the vacationers, the people who are homeowners, nature, a tax base. All of this comes into play, and it turns out to be a real great result so far, and especially over the past 20 years along the Bogue Banks and then Carteret County in North Carolina.
Wow, something that I bet all of us take for granted. We just show up at the beach and we're happy there's sand and we're not at work. Great bit of science. Thanks for sharing it with us, Spencer. That's Spencer Adkins up in West Virginia tonight. Check him out next time you're in the Huntington, West Virginia area. All right, so let's take a quick time out here from the Atlantic side. I want to tell you what's going on the Pacific side when it comes to the hurricane season, because remember, the Pacific hurricane season starts a little earlier than the Atlantic side, which is on June 1st. So they start earlier in May, so you would expect that at this point in the year, they'd have more activity. Well, in one of the rare occurrences so far, the Pacific side has not had any hurricanes yet. They've had some named storms I'll tell you about in a second, but right now there's really no activity other than Tropical Depression number 6 on the Pacific side that is in the middle of falling apart and dissipating and no longer a trackable tropical system. So nothing going on the Pacific side either. But here's a list of all the names that they have on the Pacific side. So they've gone through Amanda, Boris, and Christina. Remember, we've gone through 6. They've gone through 3. They just finished up with Tropical Depression number 6. So right now on the Atlantic side and on the Pacific side, all is kind of quiet. All right, now on to our next guest and topic. And just like everything else in the world right now, hurricanes are going to be impacted by COVID-19. Unfortunately, not the actual hurricanes themselves, but how we react to them. When hurricanes like Matthew, Florence, and Dorian hit the United States the past few years, many evacuated and took advantage of hurricane shelters. But how would shelters operate during the COVID-19 pandemic? For that answer and more, let's bring in CBS 17 meteorologist Brian Hutton Jr. Brian, you've done a lot of research on this topic and talked with emergency management officials. How are we going to shelter from hurricanes while practicing social distancing at the same time?
Yeah, that's kind of a big idea, right? It's normally people just go to a shelter, you evacuate, and you're kind of hunkered in place until the storm passes. Unfortunately, because of COVID-19, emergency officials are trying to minimize how much people congregate in shelters, and that means they're looking at alternate ways for people to shelter who have to leave the coastline, and that might mean thinking outside the box, relying more on you individually in order to seek shelter from a storm instead of relying on the government. Here's what they had to say. By the time Hurricane Florence came ashore with 90-mile-per-hour wind, an estimated 500,000 people had fled the North Carolina coast. Over 20,000 of those ended up in more than 150 shelters. So many, the state had to keep opening shelters to keep up with the demand. Several shelters were at full capacity. It happened again with Dorian. Nearly 10,000 people evacuated to 80 North Carolina shelters. But what would happen if a hurricane storms ashore during the COVID-19 pandemic? Emergency managers warn, don't make a shelter your first option.
Our first thoughts is that we would rather, if possible, people to plan to go stay with friends and family when they have to evacuate. Where they can maintain some social distancing, or to go to a hotel.
Due to the coronavirus pandemic, the North Carolina Emergency Management Agency realizes that what has worked in the past may not work now during this pandemic. Empty schools, like Sanderson High School, and universities are being explored for the possibility of being shelters to help maintain social distancing. The agency is also looking at providing more locations to keep numbers down, but that also comes at having to provide more staff, personal protective equipment, and food.
Our response would have to be a little bit different, that we would have to think more about protecting our first responders, that we would have to think more about how we shelter people, knowing that people gathered in one place can cause significant problems for spreading the virus.
One thing that hasn't changed this hurricane season is the need to be prepared.
Certainly encourage folks that in this time when, supplies might be a little bit tough to get a hold of, especially that's one more reason why you don't want to wait to build your storm kit and build that supplies that you would need for a hurricane or any type of storm. Don't wait till the last minute to plan for the hurricane season. Take care of that now while the weather's good.
State and local officials say the response to a disaster first starts with the individual. Yeah, so this year, Wes, the big thing is you kind of have to look out for yourself first. The government's going to be there. They're going to help as much as they can. But in the midst of this pandemic, if you can get yourself out of the way and not rely on the government, that's going to make things easier across the board, not only for evacuation, but also for recovery.
Now, you talk to a lot of people in North Carolina, but how are other states going to handle large hurricane shelters?
Yeah, everybody is in the same boat. Coronavirus isn't just picking on North Carolina. We're all dealing with this, and a lot of the states are doing something very similar. Officials in South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, and Louisiana all kind of have the same thought in mind, and that is that if you can do things yourself, if you don't have to come to a congregate shelter, do that first. They're still going to open shelters, but the more shelters they have to open, as was mentioned there in that piece, then that means that they have to provide more personal protective equipment. That means that they have to provide temperature checks first. And that means they're going to have to provide an isolation area in case a coronavirus outbreak develops inside the shelter itself, too. So if you can find somewhere else, like a hotel or with a friend, that's what they're stressing first, because it will be easier to socially distant and kind of stay away from large crowds of people instead of having to rely on that congregate shelter that we're used to all being, having access to in the middle of a hurricane.
Yeah. Let's remind people that not everyone evacuates during a hurricane, but the government is also saying don't make us your first option from seeking shelter. Let's dive into the who evacuates issue first.
Right. So obviously along the coast, that's where, you're going to have your people who really are evacuating. In North Carolina, like a lot of states now, right, has evacuation zones that are set up, and you're going to have your first rounds of shelters and, in those counties along the coast and then immediately inland. It's really for those people in particular that emergency managers are talking to, because if you live far enough inland, chances are you're not going to have to evacuate. But what you can do, even if you live inland, if you have a friend who lives on the coast and they're, having to evacuate, if you're comfortable with it, you can offer your place as a place for shelter, as opposed to having your friend relying on a storm shelter or having to, pay the bill for a hotel for potentially several nights. So those are the type of things on the individual level. Those along the coast, most of the time aren't going to have a say in if they can stay or not. They're going to be urged to evacuate, and they're the ones who the shelters are going to be aimed for, and not just the government, the Red Cross officials as well, who run a lot of shelters, not just in North Carolina, but across the southeast and along the mid-Atlantic coast. They're also saying we're going to have to do the same thing. They're going to provide temperature checks before people can come into a shelter. They're looking at opening more shelters to keep numbers down. They're looking at having to provide PPE. And so one thing that you can do, especially if you're in a coastal zone, in your emergency preparedness kit, grab masks and hand sanitizer that you can take with you if you do have to go to a shelter. And that way you can kind of make sure you're protecting yourself as well, kind of providing that extra level of security in case you do have to evacuate and you may end up having to find yourself into a congregate shelter.
Yeah, and one other thing we need to add to our hurricane supply list, Brian, Clorox wipes. And for those of us who've ever had to stay in a hurricane shelter, it is much more comfortable to stay with a friend or family member. So plan on that. That is Brian Hutton Jr. Thank you for that research and information. And thank you for joining us tonight. That's it for tonight's show. Tracking the Tropics is here every Tuesday night at 8 Eastern throughout the Atlantic hurricane season. In Raleigh, North Carolina, I'm Wes Hohenstein.